The action RPG genre is a popular one, with series like Diablo, Elder Scrolls, Mass Effect, and Fallout headlining the wish list of many gamers. Even so, a lot of gamers, when asked what their favorite action RPG is, tend to point their fingers in the direction of a Zelda title. In fact, even older Zelda games like Ocarina of Time tend to rank quite high in the scale. When it comes to the genre, many developers have entered the space with new and unique concepts and worlds. Many more have leaned at least lightly on other games, be it in parody or in homage. Blossom Tales: The Sleeping King is a recent release by developer Castle Pixel, who've only seen marginal success. After an unsuccessful Kickstarter that didn't even reach half the asking price for the game, the project was picked up and funded by publisher FDG Entertainment. With the game in development for at least 4 years, how did it turn out? Equip your favorite weapon and pocket those potions. We're embarking on this review of Blossom Tales: The Sleeping King. Blossom Tales immediately pops out as a sort of pixel-heavy, top-down action RPG common in many of Zelda's earliest games, but with notably greater attention to detail. The game follows the exploits of Lily, a young and newly christened Knight of the Rose, but the overall narrative is told by a grandparent to his grandchildren. True to the title of the game, Lily's king has been forced into a deep, magical sleep and can only be awoken with 3 special ingredients. While in terms of narrative, Lily isn't expected to go find these things, but she ventures out to prove her worth by finding them anyway. The way the narrative is conveyed sometimes causes some changes to how the game is experienced, usually through how Lily experiences rooms or even bosses. Usually you get to decide these changes, and while I have no evidence for it, I'd imagine these changes create slightly different scenarios and fights. In theory, this should help increase the game's replay value by encouraging replays to see how these minor detail changes affect the game. Of course, the Great Wide World is dangerous and full of monsters, bandits, and ghosts, so Lily has to be prepared to fight them. You'll rely on your sword for a lot of the game's combat, with simple slashes, combos, spin attacks, and charge attacks. One thing the developers did to differentiate Lily from other action RPG protagonists is the ability to take a leaping slash after you charge up a spin attack, and once you get the hang of it, you'll find yourself using it a lot to dispatch tougher enemies quickly. You'll find a lot of different weapons and tools to assist you on your journey. All the common fantasy game mainstays are here. Bombs, bows and arrows, potions, boomerangs, magic medallions. One thing the game does very well is making sure each item has a constant use throughout the game. Bombs blow up rocks hiding secrets, the boomerang lets you hit distant switches you can't otherwise. The bow is practical in combat, especially after its upgrade. All of the tools you'll acquire, excluding consumables like potions, use a portion of Lily's energy bar on use, which, like the hearts that show your current health, can be extended with upgrades you'll find throughout the game world. In terms of game difficulty, Blossom Tales is very forgiving. With somewhat careful gameplay, one can accrue a good number of potions and resurrection flowers, which act a lot like bottled fairies in Zelda games, which are useful for some of the game's bosses. Many of them are fairly easy, but the final bosses, and sometimes mini-bosses, of each dungeon have a bit of a learning curve or to become very difficult, so this is where those consumables come most in handy. Speaking of dungeons, Blossom Tales has 4 major dungeons to explore, and these aren't exactly themed to anything you haven't seen before. For example, Runestone Temple is forest themed, Boiling Caverns has fire and lava in abundance, and Frostfruit Shrine is a snowy, icy wonderland. Each has an abundance of enemies to fight, treasures to plunder, and puzzles to solve. Whether or not this safe sort of familiarity is good or bad is up to you. The graphics in Blossom Tales evokes a sort of 16-bit simplicity while adding in slightly more attention to detail than could have been managed on the Super Nintendo's hardware. The overworld and dungeons seem busier than anything a Zelda game of that era could have mustered, and it takes a little bit of getting used to. Even then, the sprites seem more simplistic in comparison to sprites of the same era, and it's sometimes rough to tell if this was done to make the job easier for whoever was doing sprite work on the game, or if this was the overall aesthetics that they were looking for. The music is also pretty par for the course in terms of the sort of retro feel that they were going for. It evokes a sense of mystery and adventure, and in that sense, it at least does the job that it set out to do. They say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and Blossom Tales attempts to flatter very often. There's a very heavy emphasis on being a homage to Zelda games, more specifically the Super Nintendo classic Link to the Past. It's not so much that the game pays homage to other games, since many games do that sort of thing. It's the sort of heavy-handed and unabashed way it goes about doing this that irritated me throughout my time with the game. The game's many tools throw back to Zelda. The music attempts to evoke similar feelings, and even goes so far as to basically emulate the first several notes of Zelda's Lullaby from Ocarina of Time in the background music for Haven Village. The dungeons make no real attempt to do anything unique or special to set it apart. The game is also notoriously short. I was halfway through the game in only about 4 hours, and no doubt it would have taken about 8 or 9 tops to finish. I noticed plenty of other aspects in the game that pulled from other games from the Zelda series, most notably Minish Cap, A Link Between Two Worlds, and Ocarina of Time, but these were few and far between compared. So while Blossom Tales loves to emulate A Link to the Past above all other Zelda titles, there are several things that the game failed to emulate that it really should have. For example, A Link to the Past starts with Link waking up on a rainy night to the sound of a mysterious voice, with your uncle leaving to tend to some mysterious business. Link braves the rain to infiltrate the castle and save Princess Zelda. This is one of the things that really grabbed me about the Super Nintendo Classic, as it made a strong first impression and kept you wanting more. Blossom Tales fails to do this in the opening several minutes, giving you free reign to wander wherever you want haphazardly until you stumble into the story, upon which the game thrusts you into a generic dungeon that tries desperately to emulate the sewers from A Link to the Past, complete with goodies to acquire later on in the game with your new tools. Another aspect Blossom Tales fails to emulate is an early way to move faster. Even the developers of A Link to the Past realized that traversing the game's overworld would be tedious at Link's base speed, and so gave players the Pegasus Boots. Blossom Tales has a similar item, but you don't get it until the second half of the game when you've explored a majority of the map and its value has decreased substantially. Blossom Tales does alleviate this travel time somewhat with teleport stones that let you go to and from anyone that you've found throughout the world, but A Link to the Past Ocarina item does something similar and is overall much more useful. Finally, Blossom Tales lacks one of the things that made A Link to the Past a classic and one of the most memorable and highly praised action RPGs of all time, the Dark World. This comes at a time in the game where you think it's almost over, until you've been thrust into this brand new land with more than double the Light World's dungeons to conquer. Blossom Tales has no answer to this whatsoever. If you're going to imitate one of the best Zelda games of all time, at least go the full mile. Blossom Tales gets winded in the first 1,000 feet and gives up soon after. Of course, Blossom Tales' issues don't stop at its over-enthusiastic imitating of better games. Many of the dungeons are hilariously short, padded out by enemies that have a lot of health. Mini-bosses and bosses are damage sponges and have sudden and unexpected difficulty curves much higher compared to the rest of the game. The dungeon puzzles are generally dull and lack challenge, like Pokemon levels of puzzle solving. In fact, it's not solving the puzzles themselves that will cause you frustration. Most of them have panels that, stepping on them, resets the entire thing. One slip up at one of the longer puzzles later in the game means that you're back to square one. I could forgive this if there was a greater emphasis on more and varied puzzles, but they seem to crop up in every dungeon, and sometimes more than just once. Each time I saw one, I let out a groan. The music also lacks consistency. Blossom Tales pretends to want to have similar music to retro action RPG titles, and many of the tracks at least manage to hit the target, but at least one or two tracks just don't fit with the rest of the game's soundtrack. A good example is the bomb shop music, which sounds more at home in a game like Undertale than it does in Blossom Tales. In that sense, it's either a hell of a coincidence or purposely done. Only the person assigned to create the game's music can say for sure. It's not that Blossom Tales is a bad game, it's just not a great game either. It's this middling sort of game quality that leaves me scratching my head when I see people praising the game so highly. Its current scores on Metacritic do show an agreement between critics and players alike, and Steam reviews are an average of very positive. Some might think it's a bit harsh to hold it up to A Link to the Past when comparing the two games, but the developer's insistence on imitating and paying homage to it means that it needs to be scrutinized under the same exact microscope. If you're looking for a game that plays like old top-down action RPGs, Blossom Tales will help to scratch that itch, but it won't completely satisfy it. There's just other games out there that do a better job on standing on their own 2 feet while still managing to evoke similar memories. Blossom Tales' entire experience hopes that it can tap into your Zelda nostalgia and keep you engaged all the way to the end. Blossom Tales is currently $15 on Steam, and because it's a fairly recent release, it hasn't seen any noteworthy discounts yet. Thanks for sticking around until the end. Subscribe to me here on YouTube for more Chunky Beef in the future, or follow me on social media. Links will be in the description below. See you next time.